Hello everyone, my name is Chris Snodgrass, and today I want to talk to you about a man who I think, for all the things that he endured throughout his life, was the greatest leader that the world has ever seen, and that is General/President George Washington. And George was born on February 2nd in 1732 on his father's plantation in Westmoreland County, Virginia. He was the oldest of 6 children by Augustine Washington and Mary Ball, though he did have 3 other siblings from his father's previous marriage. So he was the middle of 9 kids. The family moved around a lot when they were younger. In 1735, they moved up the river to a place called Little Hunting Creek Plantation, which later more famously became Mount Vernon. But he spent most of his childhood at a place called Ferry Farm, where the family moved in 1738. We know very little about George's childhood. There are a few common myths that everyone seems to know about the chopping down the cherry tree, or the I cannot tell a lie that he told his dad about chopping down the cherry tree. Now these things most likely became created by early biographers, and it was tied to his integrity, which people have reported saying that George had integrity that was second to none. A couple of things we do know about his childhood: when he was 11 years old, his father died, and he left most of the assets to his 2 older half-brothers. And also, he didn't receive a formal education in the form that traditionally a child of his stature would have in that time. Normally, a child of his stature would have gone to London to complete his education. George stayed in the colonies because his father had died when he was very young. He received his education from there. He excelled in mathematics, and he excelled in surveying. But his education ended when he was about 15 years old. So he never went to college, and he never learned a foreign language, which is something that was also very common at the time for a young man of his stature. Now, George was said to have a very outgoing personality. He didn't mind being the center of attention. He was very cheerful, and he also loved to dance. He's said to be a very exceptional dancer. Actually, General Greene, one of his fellow generals during the Revolutionary War, once told someone that he and his wife danced for 3 hours without ever sitting down. So the guy obviously loved to dance. He was also very proper. When he was 16 years old, he copied down the 110 Rules of Civility from one of his school books for no other reason other than to just write them down. And these 110 rules were just things that were common practice in public, especially in public, as far as manners and respect for others were concerned. And this kind of tells us a little bit about how respectful he was, and how much emphasis he put on things like that. George was very self-conscious. He suffered from dental problems his entire life. And this leads to another myth, the wooden teeth. George Washington did not have wooden teeth, though he did have dentures. But his dentures were actually spring-loaded, so he didn't really smile a whole lot, and he didn't like to speak because it was hard to. He had to clench his teeth all the time, otherwise his dentures would actually fly out of his mouth. So this caused a deformation in his jaw. That's why you see that facial expression that you do on the later portraits of him, and why he didn't do a whole lot of public speaking later on in his career. He was also a very hard worker. Now, he learned the value of hard work when his father died at 11. He was the oldest kid at home, so he didn't help his mother tend to the plantation. So at a very young age, he learned the value of hard work. He was also eager to better himself. He saved a lot of his money, and he actually was an entrepreneur. He started a lot of businesses on Mount Vernon as far as distillery and farming and things of that nature. Now, as far as leadership goes, George exhibited a lot of leadership characteristics. His integrity, which we've already mentioned, people have said was second to none. He's a very courageous person, whether it was on the battlefield or taking on new challenges. Very inspirational. He's probably one of the most inspirational people the world has ever seen. He could inspire people to do things that they would have never thought possible, and he did this time and time again during the war. He was very compassionate. He had a genuine care for the men that were fighting with him, as well as the colonists that he was fighting for, and he showed this through his actions. And he was also a flexible leader. His time in the military as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, he was autocratic. He was very autocratic. He had a way he wanted to do things. This is the way we're going to do it, and luckily, it all worked out for us. I mean, I'm glad he knew what he was talking about. But once he got into politics and the presidency, he became very democratic. He was very, I'm in charge, but we're going to do this together. Everyone needs to have a say in this. I'll welcome your ideas. Now, George was given the command of the Continental Army despite having very little experience managing a large force. Now, he was in charge during the French Revolution for the British. He was in charge of about 350 men, but they did static security, which static security is they were just guarding a post. They weren't really maneuvering and performing tactically. They were stagnant in one place. So this was a big challenge for him. He had to learn on the job, and they did suffer losses, especially early. For instance, Long Island, which was a devastating loss, where the Continental Forces lost New York, and also Brandywine was another famous loss for the Continental Army. The thing about George, though, is he had the ability to inspire his men to stay in the fight. Princeton, which happened in between Long Island and Brandywine, was a huge victory for the Continental Army. It kind of gave them a sense of, yeah, we lost this one, but look what General Washington's helped us do. So it set the tone for the rest of the war, where they would lose a fight, but the men were never out of it mentally. It was a psychological thing. They knew they were going to lose some battles, and no matter what happened, they felt like General Washington was going to get them through, and he did. Same thing happened in Monmouth. The Battle of Monmouth was outside of Philadelphia in 1778. Another huge victory for the Continental Army. And then in Yorktown in October 1781, which was where Washington defeated Cornwallis, and Cornwallis surrendered and effectively ended the war. Now in 1783, right after the war, George Washington actually resigned his commission with no intention whatsoever of ever holding public office. He wanted to go back to Mount Vernon, tend to his businesses, and live out the rest of his life with his wife. However, in 1787, he did take charge of the Continental Constitutional Convention, where they were writing the Constitution. You ever have one of those situations where you see what's going on, you know how to fix it, but nobody else around is doing anything about it? That's kind of what he felt. He's like, I'm just going to take care of this myself. The Articles of Confederation, which was what America was originally, the policy of America originally, was deteriorating, and he could see that it wasn't sufficient for what America was trying to do. So he took charge and oversaw the Constitutional Convention, and that's how the Constitution came to be. Now, after this, in 1789, he was actually appointed the first president of the United States. Now, again, for a guy who didn't want to hold public office, this was something new. I mean, he accepted it, but there was no template for it. We'd never had a president before. I mean, so it was something new, and again, he had to learn on the job, and he knew that the things that he did would set the precedent for every other president that came after him. So he was very conscious of his actions. He wouldn't overstep his bounds. He wouldn't abuse his power, because he knew that would set a bad example for future presidents, which again speaks for the man of integrity. He did have some struggles in his 2 terms as president. The first term, he wanted West Virginia expansion. He wanted to expand west and move the nation to the west, but they ran into troubles with Native American tribes, and things just didn't go the way he wanted. In that second term, there was a French Revolution going on in Europe, and France asked for help, and he had to decline. It had to be very hard for him to do, because again, France had just helped us win our independence. I mean, without France, we would not have won that war. I mean, there's no way it would have happened. So I know that had to be hard for him. I mean, it had to be, but at the time he knew that getting into a foreign war for a new country would just be completely disastrous for us. So he kept that in mind when he was like, what's best for our country and my people is to stay out of this. Like, we can't get into something like that right now. Now, George led the Continental Forces to victory over the British, who were the prominent power at the time. Like, they were better funded, they were better trained, they were better armed than anybody. I mean, the British was everybody's worst nightmare at the time. And he also spearheaded and oversaw the Constitutional Convention in 1887, came out of retirement to do it, and pulled the nation out of the shambles that were the Articles of Confederation. And he led 2 successful terms as President of the United States. These are just some of the accomplishments that George Washington had in his career, and something that, you could go on and on about the man's accomplishments. I could do a whole presentation on that, but these are just a few that I'd like to highlight. In summary, I think President Washington was the greatest leader, just the epitome of what a leader should be, the perfect template for anybody who wants to be a leader. If you want to care for your people, lead people, have people follow you, then just look into a little bit of what General and President George Washington did throughout his life, and you can learn a lot. You really can. These are just a few of the references that I got most of my information from. A couple of these books I got out of the library online, the Troy Online Library, and the other one's actually mountvernon.org website online. You can find out anything about Mount Vernon or George Washington. Just check that out. It's a really good site. And I'd like to thank you for your time. I really hope you took something away from this, and I look forward to viewing everyone else's presentation. Thank you.